Before the frost has even burned off the furrows, a body is already moving through the dark. Not a rested body. A body that has spent a lifetime learning exactly how much pain it can carry before it breaks. Because this land isn't his, and he must feed it before he ever feeds himself. Forget the castle. Forget the crown. This is the hand that built both, and history barely bothered to write it down. Picture a life where hunger doesn't visit. It moves in. It sleeps beside you. It negotiates with you every single morning before your eyes are even open. And yet, on certain days, rare days, almost holy, that same calloused hand piled beef and cheese and fresh bread onto a table so full it looked like a mistake, as if fate had briefly forgotten how to be cruel. There is a 600-year-old document that records, almost word for word, exactly what sat on a laborer's table on his best day. And in the years, there was nothing to put on the table at all. It speaks of soup, of fish boiled in ale, of a garlic sauce so plain it doubles as a definition of survival. And it speaks of something else too, a silence so total that the living could barely keep pace, burying the dead. Because behind every crust of bread in this story sits a question that outlived kings. What is a human life worth the moment half a continent has just died? You won't find the answer in any royal chronicle. It's buried in manor rolls nobody reads anymore, in a monastery's account book, in the grease-stained margin of a 500-year-old recipe. Today, we walk beside a medieval peasant from the black hour before dawn to the last bite of supper by candlelight, tasting what he tasted, fearing what he feared, and uncovering how the humblest food of the Middle Ages was quietly writing the opening chapter of a revolution. Stay until the end, because the simplest dish in this story is also the most dangerous. Welcome back to Savoring History, the channel where we don't just tell you the story of food. We cook it, we taste it, and we try to understand the past through what actually landed on people's plates. If this is your first time here, buckle up. Because today we're stepping into a kitchen most history books never bother to show you. The kitchen of the ordinary medieval peasant. The person who made up somewhere between 80 and 95% of the entire population of medieval Europe. Before we get into it, I need to ask you for something quick. Because this channel only exists and only grows because of people like you. If you haven't subscribed to Savoring History yet, now's the perfect time. Every week, we bring you a new historical recipe, a new deep dive into a period that feels distant but has more to do with your own dinner table than you'd think. Drop a like too. It takes 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps this channel reach more curious people just like you. And here's something I love doing on this channel. I want to know exactly where in the world you're watching from right now. Drop your country and your city down in the comments. I read almost every single one. And it's honestly incredible watching this map of historical curiosity light up from every corner of the planet. From tiny villages in Scotland to massive cities across the US, Brazil, India, Australia. So, where are you right now while this medieval stew is simmering on your screen? Today's journey is about survival, labor, and a humble fish dish almost nobody cooks anymore. Barbel boiled and served with a garlic sauce, a recipe from around 1450 that was considered good enough to feed the people who held the entire structure of medieval society on their backs. We're going to figure out why this food was so plain, what that plainness reveals about inequality, and how a chain of catastrophes, famine, plague, mass death, ended up handing peasants, tragically and ironically, more power than they'd ever had before. Let's cook this story. A medieval peasant's day didn't start with the sun. It started before it, in the cold dark that comes right before dawn, when the body still protests every movement and the ground is still slick with dew. There was no alarm clock, no clock on any wall, just the deeply ingrained habit of centuries of farm labor, and a very real fear that showing up late to the field meant less food on the table by year's end. One of the questions people ask most about medieval eating is deceptively simple. Did ordinary people even eat breakfast? The honest answer, as with most things in history, is it depends. It depended on the era, the region, and above all, on social class. But for manual laborers, the ones dragging the plow and bringing in the wheat under a punishing sun, the answer tends to lean toward yes, at least during certain months of the year. A construction record from northern France, dated to 1474, lays this out with almost bureaucratic precision. From the end of March through the end of September, the masons working on a particular building were required to start no later than 5:30 in the morning and worked straight through until 8 a.m., when they finally got a 1-hour break for breakfast. What was on the menu was rarely negotiable. Bread, cheese, and beer, very often supplied by the employer as part of the day's wages. Notice the cold, practical logic hiding underneath this. It wasn't generosity. It was an investment. An underfed worker produces less, tires faster, gets sick more often. Minimally feeding the labor force was as much a part of feudalism's machinery as rent collection and taxation. Out in the open fields, far from any construction site, the ritual was even simpler and occasionally deadly. Rural laborers very often just stopped exactly where they stood to eat. No table, no shelter, sitting on packed dirt between the very furrows they'd carved themselves. And that simplicity, unfortunately, sometimes came with a price. In August of 1346, a man named William of Oxfordshire, an ordinary laborer, not a clergyman, despite what his name might suggest, was digging a pit when he decided to stop for breakfast. He sat down inside the very hole he was digging. Moments later, the earthen walls collapsed on top of him. He died right there, buried during what should have been just another unremarkable breakfast on just another unremarkable workday. That story, preserved in the coroner's records of the period because accidental deaths had to be investigated and logged, reminds us of something essential. Behind every statistic about what peasants ate is a real, fragile life, subject to the same brutal randomness ours is. It's also worth saying that breakfast wasn't a universal habit even among laborers. In winter, when daylight shrank and fieldwork slowed to a crawl, most people simply waited for the midday meal. The summer breakfast, tied directly to the physical demands of sun-up to sundown labor, practically vanished once the workdays got shorter. Meanwhile, on the other end of the social ladder, certain theologians were busy debating whether eating first thing in the morning was, in fact, sinful. Drawing on texts like Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, parts of the church linked eating too early or too quickly to a subcategory of gluttony called pre-prepare. There's something almost funny about it. While the wealthy argued over the morality of breakfast, the poor were simply eating because their bodies demanded it to survive the day ahead. And that's exactly where the first great hidden truth of the medieval table lives. Food was never just about nutrition. It was regulation. It was hierarchy. It was theology. It was raw survival dressed up as routine. A piece of bread eaten before sunrise could be, depending entirely on who ate it, an act of subsistence or a condemnable indulgence. And that distinction, as absurd as it sounds today, shaped the daily life of millions of people. And our peasants' day had barely even started. The sun was still low on the horizon, the dew still soaking through worn boots, and ahead of him stretched hours and hours of labor before the day's real meal, the one everyone actually looked forward to, would finally arrive. If there was one meal that truly defined a medieval peasant's day, it was prandium, the midday meal, and generally the heartiest one he'd get access to. But to really understand what showed up on that table, we first need to understand a very specific piece of feudal machinery: the boon day, or the extra day of work. Think of it as the medieval version of your boss telling everyone to come in on Saturday for inventory, but promising pizza to make up for it. That comparison isn't a stretch. English manorial records describe, with almost administrative enthusiasm, the special menu reserved for harvest days, when even the lowest-ranking serf was called in for an intense, collective push. One of these records reads, almost verbatim, "All who come to the wheat harvest boon work shall have for dinner soup, wheat bread, beef and cheese, and for supper, bread, cheese, and their fill of ale. On the other work day, they shall have soup, wheat bread, fish, and cheese, again with unlimited ale. Each worker could eat as much bread as he wanted at midday, and received a whole loaf just for himself come evening. Compare that to the plain bread, cheese, and ale breakfast we just walked through, and the contrast is stark. On these specific days, the peasant's table filled up with protein, something rare in his everyday diet. Beef, fish, cheese in abundance, all carefully timed by the Lord to guarantee that the year's most physically demanding, time-sensitive work got done with maximum energy. That calculated abundance points to a deeper structural truth about medieval society. Somewhere between 80 and 95% of the population was made up of peasants. But that doesn't mean they were a single, homogeneous group. There were relatively free peasants who paid rent to their lord but could relocate, run small side businesses like brewing ale or weaving cloth, and even build up some wealth of their own. And there were serfs, villains, as they were called, bound to their lord's land, with no freedom to leave at all. The 14th century chronicler Jean Froissart summed up this relationship bluntly. It was custom in England, as in several other countries, for the nobility to hold enormous power over commoners, keeping them in bondage. Their tenants were bound by custom to work the lord's land, to bring in his grain, to make his hay, and to cut and haul home his firewood. In practice, this meant a lord might hold a manor or several manors, ranging anywhere from a couple hundred to several thousand acres, and would divide much of that land into narrow strips handed off to peasant families to farm. But handed off is a generous word. The family paid for that right, whether in a share of what they grew, in cash, or in some combination of both. And they still owed extra days of labor on whatever land the Lord kept for himself. Manorial documents went so far as to spell out, peasant by peasant, exactly how much work each person owed. One record describes a man named Reynold of Sol, who held 1 virgate of land and was required to work the first 4 days of every single week, all year round. His only relief coming on feast days, which counted as time off. And when it wasn't planting or harvest season, the work simply changed shape. It never lost intensity. That same Reynold had to build 32 feet of fence a year, 24 feet of hedge, muck out the stables, produce straw. There's a popular internet myth claiming medieval peasants worked fewer days than we do. But that completely ignores the fact that, on top of their mandatory service to the Lord, they still had to tend their own land and their own survival, with no real days off in any modern sense of the phrase. It was exactly this brutal cycle of unending labor for subsistence wages that, decades later, would push peasants toward a radical response. But that's a story we're saving for the end of our day. For now, it's time to sit down, even if it's on the bare ground, and taste what actually made up this midday meal. The fish. When we think of medieval recipes that survived into cookbooks today, we're almost always talking about dishes prepared for kings, dukes, and bishops. Dishes loaded with expensive spices like saffron, clove, and mace. The problem is obvious. A peasant would never have had access to any of that. So how do we reconstruct what he actually ate? The answer sits in a fascinating detail buried in a culinary manuscript from around 1450. A recipe for a fish called barbel. The text itself hands us the clue we need. The barbel, it says, though he be of a fine shape and looks big, yet he is not accounted the best fish to eat. In other words, it was the leftover fish, exactly the kind of food a lord would hand down to his laborers. Barbel belongs to the carp family, a river bottom feeder without the prestige of a salmon or the delicacy of a trout. And it's precisely that ordinariness, accessible, unglamorous, easy to catch, that makes it the perfect stand-in for what most of the medieval population actually ate, rather than the luxuries documented in noble banquet books. The original circa 1450 recipe is striking in how bare bones it is. Take a barbel and cut him, and draw him round, and pike him in the nape of the head, and seethe him in water and salt, ale and parsley. And when it beginneth to boil, skim it clean, and cast the barbel thereto, and seethe him, and his sauce is garlic or verja sauce, and then serve him forth. Notice the key detail. The fish was boiled in nothing more than water, salt, ale, and parsley. No expensive spice, no touch of luxury anywhere in sight. Just basic ingredients, available in any peasant kitchen. That stands in direct contrast to the noble recipes of the same period, almost always loaded with an elaborate mix of imported seasonings. The sauce served alongside was just as revealing. A garlic sauce recipe from the same period reads, "Take kernels of walnuts and cloves of garlic and pepper, bread and salt, and cast all in a mortar, and grind it small, and mix it with the same broth that the fish was boiled in, and serve it forth." Only one spice, pepper, a sharp contrast to aristocratic sauces, which often stacked 5, 6, 7 different spices into a single dish. That difference isn't some irrelevant technical footnote. It's actually a social map. Every additional spice in a medieval recipe represented money, international trade, status. A dish seasoned with nothing but pepper quietly told the story of someone who couldn't afford more than that, and still took pride in seasoning what little they had. The cooking method says something too. Nearly everything, meat and fish alike, was boiled, not because boiling was considered the tastiest technique, but because it was practical, cheap on fuel when done in large communal pots, and let the cook repurpose the leftover broth, which is exactly what became the base of that garlic sauce. Nothing was wasted. The broth from boiling the fish became the liquid base for the sauce, binding together stale bread, another ingredient that couldn't go to waste, into a thick, nourishing paste. Every element of a peasant meal carried that same quiet principle. Economy as survival, resourcefulness as a way of life. So while the lord of the manor was likely sitting down to a nobler fish seasoned with imported saffron, his laborer was eating barbel boiled in ale with garlic sauce. Plain, functional, but according to anyone who's actually cooked and tasted it today, surprisingly good. Poor ingredients, it turns out, didn't necessarily mean poor flavor. There's something almost poetic in that. Centuries later, a dish designed to be the bare minimum, the fish nobody wanted, seasoned with whatever was left in the pantry, can still catch you off guard with how the acidity, the salt, and the soft bitterness of ground walnut come together. Humble ingredients were never a synonym for careless cooking. As the sun started its slow descent, a medieval peasant still had hours of work ahead of him. Unlike our modern idea of a fixed workday with a set clock-out time, agricultural labor followed the daylight itself. And in summer, that meant brutally long days, stretching from sunrise almost to full dark. The last meal of the day, called cena, a word that survives almost unchanged in modern Italian and Spanish for dinner, was typically lighter than the midday meal. For most people, that meant bread, cheese, maybe a little beer, and occasionally the cold leftovers of whatever porridge had been made the night before. But on those special collective work days, the boon days we already covered, supper got a generous upgrade. Bread, cheese, and ale, without limit. And according to the records, each worker received an entire loaf all to himself. A gesture that, modest as it looks to modern eyes, represented real abundance to people who lived with scarcity most of the year. It's worth stressing that this generosity wasn't pure kindness. It was strategy. A lord who underfed his workers during the most critical stretches of the agricultural calendar, planting and harvest, risked jeopardizing an entire season's yield. Plentiful food at key moments was, essentially, a calculated investment in productivity. Outside those seasonal peaks, though, the average peasant's life followed a script of relentless repetition. And here it's worth dismantling a fairly popular modern myth. The idea that medieval peasants worked fewer days than we do today, coasting through dozens of religious holidays scattered across the calendar. Yes, there were feast days on the liturgical calendar that counted as time off from a peasant's obligations to his lord. But that ignores something crucial. Labor owed to the lord was only half the equation. Once he'd fulfilled his mandatory days, which, according to some records, ran as high as 4 per week all year long, a peasant still had to tend his own strip of land, grow his own food, repair his own tools. Manorial documents make this clear by listing off supplementary tasks outside the harvest season: fence building, hedge maintenance, mucking out stables, producing straw. Work never truly stopped. It just changed shape with the seasons, shifting between the fields and a dozen smaller maintenance jobs essential to the community's survival. That reality of non-stop labor hit hardest for those classified as serfs or villains, legally bound to their lord's land, with no freedom to negotiate their own value in the labor market, even when a neighboring manor offered better terms. Free peasants, meanwhile, though also overworked, at least had the theoretical option of pursuing alternatives, opening a small brewery, weaving and selling cloth, slowly building up some capital of their own. By nightfall, exhausted, hands still caked with dirt and his body aching from hours bent over the harvest, the peasant finally sat down to his simple supper. No luxury, no excess, just the fuel needed to wake up the next morning and start the entire cycle again, repeated for decades, for generations, for centuries on end. But that seemingly eternal cycle, that machinery that appeared destined to keep turning exactly the same way forever, was about to be shattered in a way nobody at the time could have possibly imagined. And it's toward that breaking point, arguably the single most transformative moment in medieval food history, that we're heading next. Because what happened over the following decades wouldn't just change what ended up on a peasant's plate. It would irreversibly change who got to decide the value of an entire day's sweat-soaked labor under the sun. To really understand the weight of every meal we've covered so far, we need to understand the climate and demographic backdrop that shaped centuries of European history. In the years leading up to the 14th century, Europe lived through what historians call the medieval warm period, a stretch of time when the climate was unusually on agriculture's side. The evidence from this era is almost hard to believe today. There are records of grapevines thriving in central England, a region we now consider far too cold for serious viticulture. That climate abundance produced strong harvests, and strong harvests produced something even more significant: an explosion in population. In England, where historical records are especially well preserved, the population roughly doubled between the years 1100 and 1300, jumping from around 2 million people to roughly 5 million. But around the year 1300, the continent began sliding into what became known as the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped, growing patterns shifted dramatically, goodbye English grapevines, and failed harvests became increasingly common. What had been an era of relative abundance turned, within just a few decades, into a recurring nightmare of scarcity. Between 1315 and 1317, a devastating stretch of torrential rain, combined with livestock disease, triggered what we now call the Great Famine. A catastrophe that swept across nearly all of Europe, driving food production down by as much as 80% in some regions. Food prices spiked between 100 and 300% within just a couple of years, an economic shock capable of wiping out entire families overnight. The records from that time carry a horror that's still difficult to process. The Annals of Bristol, from 1315, describe a famine so severe, with such staggering mortality, that the living could barely keep up with burying the dead. Horseflesh and dog meat came to be considered good eating, and some people, in absolute desperation, resorted to eating their own children. The Great Famine killed somewhere between 10 and 20% of the population in some regions, a devastating number on its own, but one that would turn out to be, tragically, just a preview of what was still coming. Because in 1346, the Black Death reached Europe, and in less than a decade, somewhere between 30 and 50% of the entire continent's population was dead. Some villages recorded a 100% mortality rate, entire communities that simply ceased to exist. It was here, in the middle of this demographic apocalypse, that something almost paradoxical was born. With so many workers dead, there weren't enough hands left to farm all the nobility's land. And suddenly, an old, ruthless economic law, supply and demand, started working in favor of the very few peasants left alive. Free laborers began to realize they could actually negotiate. If a neighboring manor offered 2 shillings and a pig to come work its fields for a week, that was a real opportunity, as long as you were legally free to take it. The problem was that most of the population, especially in England, were still serfs, bound to their lord's land by law and by centuries of custom. And right there, at that exact point of tension between a new economic reality and an outdated legal system that refused to bend, the first seeds were planted for conflicts that would explode in the decades to follow. Peasant revolts, demands for fair wages, open questioning of a system that, until then, had seemed as unchangeable as the seasons themselves. The food we've put on the table today, that plain loaf of bread, that boiled fish, that wedge of cheese split among an entire family, carries this whole story inside it. Abundance, famine, death, and finally, the very first spark of bargaining power ordinary laborers had ever experienced. Every bite, every sip of ale, every spoonful of garlic sauce is, in a very real sense, a surviving fragment of one of the deepest social transformations in European history. And that's how we close out this journey through a single day, a day that, in truth, carries centuries of history, inequality, resilience, and eventual transformation inside it. From the rushed breakfast before dawn to the plain supper by candlelight, every meal a medieval peasant ate was, at once, practical survival and quiet testimony to a system built to extract the maximum amount of labor for the minimum possible return. But maybe the most powerful part of this story isn't the scarcity itself. It's what came after it. Famine and plague, for all the horror they carried, cracked open a machine that had once seemed eternal, and handed back, however painfully and incompletely, a sliver of bargaining power to the people who had always been at the bottom of the pyramid. Remember what I told you at the very start, that the simplest dish in this story was also the most dangerous? Now you know why. A bowl of boiled fish and garlic sauce didn't just feed a peasant. It quietly kept him alive long enough to one day demand his worth. And that demand is what finally cracked an entire social order. If this trip into the past sparked your curiosity, you know what to do. Drop a like, subscribe to Savoring History, and let me know in the comments where in the world you watch this from. Next time you sit down at your own table, maybe you'll look at your plate a little differently. Because even the simplest meal is carrying a story just waiting to be tasted. Until next time.